Hello and welcome to the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain webinar series. I'm Mike Ellen and I serve AIM as their Member Engagement Manager. AIM North America is an alliance enabling the cooperation, development, standardization of AIDC technologies from barcodes to RFID to IoT. AIM North America is your advocate. Any organization with an interest in data collection is a beneficiary of these efforts. Membership provides an opportunity to influence the direction of the industry, develop policies and standards, access market reports, and engage new partners. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to go over. First is our antitrust policy. It's the policy of AIM Inc. to conduct its operations in strict compliance with the antitrust laws. No AIM activity shall create even the appearance of a violation of the letter or spirit of the antitrust laws. AIM North America's collaboration and work product policy also states that presentations like today's are held for the primary purpose of advancements in our industry, which necessarily involves development of work product intended solely for the public domain. AIM's developed this policy for the protection of its members who engage in this important collaborative effort. Also, attendees are muted throughout the presentation. If you have a question, Lori will be answering some at the end of the presentation. If we do not have time to answer your question, we will be reviewing these questions and responding to you via email after the webinar. To ask questions, go to the chat option and type it to AIM Member Services. All registrants will also be notified when the presentation recording is available. Today, I'm here with Lori Bitar of FlexCon. Lori is FlexCon's Market Development Manager and also serves the chair for AIM North America's Pharma Work Group. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for the introduction. Welcome, everybody. So it's either good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. And I thank you all for participating in this webinar and learning with me as we talk about the drug supply chain, the initiatives with the FDA regarding the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, some considerations regarding COVID-19 and our crisis management, as well as some ending statements regarding the work that we are doing in the AIM Pharma Work Group. So thank you, Mike, and thank you all for joining me. So let's talk about some things that are leading up to what's happening currently today. And we're going to talk about compromises to the safety of our drug supply chain. A few of you may remember the scare that happened with Tylenol back in September of 1982, where someone had walked into a pharmaceutical company, actually opened some materials and laced the materials with cyanide poisoning. Out of that came 7 deaths, and the crime was never, still to this day, was never solved. Back then, J&J took instantly $50 million off of their revenue to answer the product recall and liability issues. Forward a little bit ahead of time from there, in 2008, there was a catastrophe with the contaminated blood thinner, heparin. What happened was they tried to lower the cost of the ingredients, and the source from that came from China, and it was hard to trace, and that led to dozens of deaths and hundreds of allergic reactions. In 2009 and 2010, the pharmaceutical supply was hampered by 2 clever brothers that were able to steal millions of pharmaceuticals. In 2009, they went into a warehouse in Virginia, GSK warehouse, and they got off with $13 million of pharmaceuticals. $5 million worth of that was for asthma medication. That ended up being surfaced in 22 pharmacies in Texas, and that medicine entered the black market of pharmaceuticals. In 2010, the same brothers scaled a warehouse in Enfield, Connecticut, Eli Lilly warehouse, and they made off with $100 million of antipsychotic and cancer drug medication. Followed in 2012, $6.7 million of oxycodone entered the US illegally. Again, hard to trace. We believe the origins came from Romania and India, and they ended up being sold in our online pharmacies. In 2012 and 2013, again, our medicine was tampered by diluting vials of a cancer drug. So a clever pharmacist, unfortunately, found a way to reduce the quantities of a life-saving drug. It was worth $10,000 in a vial, and this tampering affected 932 medical practices. In July of 2012, Congress started to focus on this gray market. There was a lot of misleading, mischievous activities that were going on that was creating shortages in the supply chain. So what they were doing was they were transitioning product from a warehouse to a pharmaceutical back to a warehouse, creating a longer chain. And in tracking this, by the time that it was sold in the pharmaceutical line, it was an 8,471% markup. And unfortunately, it was a medicine that was so desperately needed at the time. In 2012, those of you living in New England are probably painfully aware of the New England compounding chemical company that was involved in some faulty vials that had fungal meningitis, and it led to an outbreak. There were 753 cases, 64 deaths, and it involved 20 states. There were 13 defendants, and 178 charges were filed against those defendants. Following April of 13, there was a state of disarray, and Congress started to inspect all pharmacy compounding abuses based on this NECC issue. On the heels of the catastrophe, President Barack Obama signed a tightening law regarding the Drug Distribution Supply Drug Quality Security Act. That was part one. Part two, which is what we'll be focusing on today, is the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. So the creation of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act was enacted to enhance the security of the drug supply chain and the US FDA's ability to protect consumers from exposure to potentially harmful drugs which may be harmful due to counterfeit, contamination, theft, or damage. The DSCSA, or DSCSA, sorry about that, set forth a path to prevent and remove counterfeit, contaminated, stolen, and otherwise harmful drugs from the market and to enable a rapid response when these drugs are identified. So this is a 10-year endeavor, again, that started in November of 2013. And this slide shows activity of the DSCSA timeline. There's planned activities for the FDA, and then there's implementation for the stakeholders that are involved. So starting in 2014, the FDA set forth some guidelines and outlines. Starting in 2015 through 17, the industry was very active in making sure that their drug supply line up to date was secure. There's also some public meetings that the FDA has. Supposedly they've had 3. There's another 2 yet to come. And the heavy lifting from current until 2023, where they hope that this is all tied up and they have security in the supply chain. There's a lot of work that's being done currently up until the end of this in November of 2023. So just to review the timeline, in January 1st of 2015, all pharma manufacturers are to print lot numbers on packaging for all prescription drugs. Effective November 27th, 2018, pharmaceutical manufacturers and repackagers are to include unique serial numbers and expiration dates on prescription drug packaging. This information has to be presentable in human readable format and in GS1 barcodes. It has to also include 2D barcodes or data matrix codes. Manufacturers and repackagers have to capture and store what's known as the T3, which is a transaction information, transaction history, and transaction statements in their databases for a period of 6 years. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. So November 27, 2019, pharma wholesalers must authenticate and verify prescription drugs before reselling them. They must also only buy and sell products that have serial numbers and appropriate barcodes, as well as they must be able to capture the T3 documentations for product tracing. They will also need to authenticate and verify saleable returns using what is known as the VRS, or Verification Router Service. Effective coming soon, November 27th, 2020, dispensers, which is the last chain in this supply chain, the dispensers or pharmaceuticals will need to have processes in place to authenticate and verify that all medicines that they buy before selling them to consumers will have to have all of this information where they can track and trace it. So what is that data known as the T3 data? That includes transaction information. It includes the product name, strength and dose, the national drug code number, container size, and the number of containers, the lot number, transaction date, shipment date, and the name of the previous owner. The transaction history number, known as TH, is the chain of custody transaction information for each prior transaction going back to the manufacturer. So everyone within the supply chain, when they possess the product, they have to have this transaction information, and they have to have the transaction history. Followed by the last of the T3 data, which is the transaction statement. And that entity which transfers the ownership in a transaction. It is authorized as required under the DSCSA, received a product from person or entity that is authorized under the DSCSA. In other words, they have to be licensed, and they have to keep up with that license validation year upon year. And that the transaction identifier and the transaction statement is received from each prior owner of the product as it is required by the DSCSA. And again, all of this data must be stored and maintained for a period of 6 years. So the timeline is fast approaching. From the onset of this initiative started with Barack Obama in 2013, with its conclusion date fast approaching in November of 2023. By the end of this time, the entire supply chain must be DSCSA compliant. There needs to be complete unit level traceability, including aggregation. This will be mandatory. So going back to the original slide, which outlined some of the FDA's responsibility, the FDA will set up rules and regulations, and I think to those as guideposts, if you will, or guardrails that sometimes have speed bumps along the way and checkpoints along the way. The FDA will set up these rules and regulations, but yet it's the industry, which we're all members of, that need to make sure that we have the technology in place that will help move this project and initiative along so that everyone involved will be compliant. So what they do, the FDA sets up pilot project programs, and that involves everybody from the supply chain stakeholders, including the FDA. And what they're doing is they're working on the development of the electronic interoperable system, which will identify and trace certain prescription drugs as they are distributed within the United States. There's a cross-section of participants which have volunteered to partake in this program, and they're going to explore and evaluate the methods to enhance the safety and security of the drug supply chain. These participants represent a diverse group, both large and small companies within the supply chain sectors. The selection into the program should not be interpreted as the FDA's position on an entity's compliance with regulatory requirements, nor should it be interpreted as an endorsement of a particular technology, system, or approach used in the pilots. So taken off of the FDA website, these are the member companies that are involved in the pilot program. Amerisource, Burgeon, Cardinal Health, McKesson, they are the largest wholesale distributors within the pharmaceutical supply chain, and they are involved in several programs that are testing out the interoperability of the program. Cardinal Health, as of April 2019, they have processed 14.8 million inbound serialized units and 2,000 serialized lots of product. Cardinal Health is actively involved in this pilot program. They're looking at potential challenges regarding the verification and the exemptions or the exceptions to ensure the product is not held up due to a perceived lack of compliance. They're also handling of suspect and illegitimate products. They're responsible for writing guidance, and they're checking within the supply chain, within their immediate supply chain, to make sure that everyone that participates in movement of the product is compliant. So in other words, if they were to be audited, are they checking their systems, and are they making sure that they're covering all aspects of an audit, especially in light of counterfeiting that's happening in the system still today? Will they be able to identify suspect material, and how do they go through the validation of that? Let's see, GS1 is another one. Obviously, the industry is pretty much using GS1 barcodes now, so they're actively involved in this pilot program. ID Logic, they're looking at the next generation of advanced cryptographic ID and authentication. They're involved heavily in blockchain management, which is happening across the industry. Okay, the Pharmaceutical Distribution Security Alliance, they're involved in the governance process. So by the time this whole initiative is completed, they're looking to maybe form a new nonprofit governance organization to ensure the interoperability of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. Sanofi, obviously, they're a large pharmaceutical supplier. They have production, they're a French company. So they're looking at the contract manufacturing organization and product identification verifications when they're outsourcing a part of the manufacturing of their product. So unfortunately, the supply chain is being taxed right now currently due to the COVID-19 crisis. Pharmacies, they still need to be able to get prescription. The supply chain was already taxed where we had shortages of certain prescription drugs before this happened. So there are some exceptions that happen, and due to the pandemic, the FDA did announce that there are exclusions and exceptions under the DSCSA served to mitigate any disruptions to the prescription drug supply chain during this crisis. The FDA has issued a statutory exemption and exclusion for the distribution of covered COVID-19 products, including those prescription drugs which receive an emergency use authorization designed by the FDA, or products which the FDA approves for the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, or treatment of the virus. So the exclusion and the exemptions are for trading partners. They are not required to comply with track and trace requirements triggered by a transaction. The exemption does not apply to DSCSA requirements not triggered by a transaction. Distributor activities related to the COVID-19 emergency are not required to comply with the licensure provisions, reporting requirements, or wholesale distributor requirements under the DSCSA. So you can go on the FDA website and find out the latest and greatest news. What happens is that this announcement lasts for a period of 90 days and gets renewed 90 days until at which it is authorized that the exceptions no longer apply. So you can also go through online, you can email, or you can call for any questions pertaining to the exceptions. Okay, industry participation. So currently I am the head of the Pharma Work Group for the AIM. And the AIM is the Global Industry Association that connects, standardizes, and advances automatic identification technologies. They serve for solutions and services where they connect the right people who can provide the right answers to any challenges within the industry. They have a knowledge and resource base. They gain access to unbiased information in the ever-changing automatic identification and data capture industry. There's industry groups that network with the industry's thought leaders in AIDC, IoT, RFID, track and trace, and standards. Also, the AIM is able to write standards where they understand asset tracking and data collection standards from a development, public review, and publication perspective. So currently, the AIM Pharma Group is working on updating the DSCSA position paper. We're also developing a line of pharma webinar series, which this is the first one. We also act as a resource to the FDA and the DSCSA team. There are members of the FDA that participate in AIM Global and AIM North America. We also outline panel discussions and opportunities at industry events. I know that we're talking about attending the PAC Expo and the RFID Journal, should those events take place live. We're also collaborating with the pharma industry, and we're collaborating with other work groups that may be working on the same initiatives as us. Okay, and with that, Mike, I know that we probably have some questions or comments that may be coming in.
Yes, thank you, Lori, for your information today. Very much appreciate it. If you still are interested in sending any questions or comments, just go to the chat option and select AIM Member Services. But I'll get to some of these questions right now. If you're ready, Lori.
I am.
Okay, great. First question we have is, what pharmaceutical products are covered under this act?
Okay, so under the Act, a prescription drug is in its finished dose form for administration to a patient without further manufacturing. So that includes capsules, tablets, and lyophilized products before reconstitution. So that basically includes your vaccines. Some of the items that are not covered are new products. I know that there's a lot of work going on with plasma and platelets for blood. So any blood products that are intended for infusion are not covered. Radioactive drugs or biologics are not covered. IV drugs, homeopathic drugs are not covered either.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question we received, this company was wondering how they would get involved with the pilot programs.
So within this webinar, there are a list of active companies that are involved in the pilot programs. The pilot program has been closed as of last year. So they have a wide list of customers that are involved in every aspect of pharmaceutical supply. One of those companies is actively involved, and that's Cardinal Health. So if you look to Cardinal Health and you go on their website, they have monthly meetings at the beginning of every month on Monday, and they have a call-in number with port access to those calls. So among those customers or suppliers or industry stakeholders that are involved in the pilot program, if you work with them, if they're a customer or a supplier, and you would like to be involved, I'm sure that you can contact them and supply input as needed as these programs are in development.
Great, thanks, Lori. And how can we learn more about this, the FDA public announcements or workshops guidance?
So if you go into the FDA website under the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, the very first item that comes up in blue highlight is a link so that you can sign in and with your email, and they can update you of any updates that are happening currently with this Drug Supply Chain Security Act.
Okay, Lori, thank you so much for your time and your insights today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining. I hope everyone continues to be safe through this, and I'm sure that we're going to be learning a lot coming out of this COVID-19. There's a lot of initiatives that are taking place with the FDA, with our current executive staff. You know, we're looking at outsourcing pharmaceuticals. We're also looking at increasing our own capability to produce our own pharmaceuticals. And I think what we're learning is, you know, stockpiling doesn't work, but there needs to be a balance on, you know, how do you predict for these situations and how do you make sure that you have a nimble, agile pharmaceutical supply chain. So there will be a lot of work coming out of this.
Awesome. Thank you, Lori. And again, we had some other questions. I have taken note of those, and we'll reach out to those people afterwards, and we'll try to answer those questions for you, but appreciate those as well. So
Okay.
Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day today, everyone.
Thank you.